that or engage somebody, purchase maybe clauses from a law firm. Make sure that what you're doing with those clauses is doing what you intend for them to do, or that they're accomplishing what you and your buyers intended for them to accomplish. One of the big areas that I've had literally dozens and dozens of phone calls has been from buyer's agents who have written appraisal clauses, appraisal gap clauses, that have said, you know, the buyer agrees to bring additional dollars, pick your dollar amount, and I'm hearing astronomical numbers, up to $200,000 beyond appraised value kind of numbers, which is insane, right? I mean, it is absolutely insane. But buyer agrees to bring the additional money if the property doesn't appraise, but these are unilateral clauses, right? And so buyer's agents will call and say, well, the property didn't appraise, there was a $20,000 appraisal gap clause, the appraisal was $25,000 short, and so it didn't appraise. Doesn't the seller have to bring their price down? Don't they have to lower the purchase price now to be the appraised value plus the $20,000? And my answer in 99.9% of the cases is no. The seller is not committing to do anything in these appraisal gap clauses. It's only the buyer that's committing to do something. The buyer is unilaterally committing to do something. The seller doesn't have an obligation to reduce the purchase price by 1 penny, regardless of any changes. And so that as a buyer's agent, when you call me and I have to give you that answer, or after you read me the clause, and I do explain the fact that these are generally unilateral clauses, not bilateral clauses, that poor buyer's agent has to pick up the phone and call their buyer, who thought, as they were writing that clause, that they were covered on the seller side as well, and they in fact weren't. So there's a little bit of egg on the face, I think, of buyer's agents who aren't properly drafting or explaining those clauses to their buyers. And so anytime you're dealing with any clauses, making sure your buyers understand the implications of what you're doing and what they don't do is super important. You could write a clause like that would be a bilateral clause, would require the seller to actually reduce the purchase price, but the clause would have to require that. It would have to read something like, buyer agrees to bring up to an additional money and seller agrees to accept, right? There'd have to be a second half of that clause that was written. Sorry, I'm getting a phone call. There would have to be the second half to make that a mutual or a bilateral clause rather than a unilateral clause. So as you're writing these things, be thinking about the bigger picture, because it really is embarrassing, I think, for buyer's agents to have to call their buyers back and have that discussion. As it relates as well, short-term and long-term concerns regarding appraisal gap clauses. I think a lot of buyers don't understand that when you commit to bringing an additional $20,000 to the closing if a property doesn't appraise, I don't think they fully understand that that is not a sort of wiggle room, or maybe I'll do it if I can afford to do it, or I'll do it if the lender says that I can afford to do it after they get through their process. It's an affirmative commitment that they're bringing to that they're making to bring the additional money if the property doesn't appraise and it's within that gap. And there's no wiggle room to it. So one of the things that I'm seeing a ton more inquiry of is earnest money disputes. A lot more phone calls related to sellers who are essentially calling the buyer's bluff and saying, hey, you're not terminating this contract in good faith based on the loan, because what it really is that you aren't able to bring the additional $10 or $15 or $20,000 over and above the appraised value that you committed to bringing. And honestly, as you guys probably know, in paragraph 5.2 of the contract, which is the loan condition paragraph, I'm on forms committee, but we have a sentence at the beginning of, well, this is now the third year that that's in play, but there's now a sentence in that says, this is not a contingency that has anything to do with appraisal. If you've got appraisal contingencies, that has to do with your appraisal dates and deadlines, not your loan conditions. And so as you're writing these clauses and having your buyer instruct you to write these clauses, please go the extra mile to make sure they understand that this is not just something that they're doing to write a sexy offer that they maybe won't get accepted anyhow and they'll never have to live up to. It's an affirmative commitment that they are making at the time that they sign that contract, or the buyer, at least at the time the seller accepts that contract. And I think there's a lot of that going on that they're not being properly explained to buyers. So that's a short-term concern that I have with those things. The long-term concern that I have with these appraisal gap clauses and these overvalue offers that are being closed on is the concept that buyers aren't thinking about, that I'm sure most of you are, though, because you're real estate professionals, and that's this concept of negative equity, right? These buyers that are moving into their homes right now, closing with $20,000, $50,000, $200,000 in negative equity, that's super problematic in my view. I think it should be in anybody's view, but your buyers aren't necessarily thinking about that. They expect that you're going to be thinking about concept of negative equity, because you ought to be talking to them about that. But imagine just, and many of us have lived through, it was only 10 or 12 years ago that we were in that sort of mortgage crisis, property depression, and everybody, you couldn't give away real estate. And that was the first real smack in everybody's face in a long time that the real estate industry realized, well, wait a second, real estate is not just a naturally only inclining value proposition, right? There are waves and there's twists and turns to our business. And imagine just over the course of the next couple of years, that buyer who is now in $100,000 negative equity in a property they closed on under your tutelage as a buyer's agent. And God forbid the market takes a turn. God forbid interest rates go up, or inflation really kicks in, as I think many people are prognosticating might well, or be a natural flow from the incredible amounts of money that is being printed in Washington, D.C. right now. But let's assume that occurs and that the market stays flat, or even worse, the market goes down. And 4 years from now, the same buyer who purchased their home with $100,000 in negative equity still has $100,000 in negative equity, or God forbid, the market's declined and now they have $150,000 or $200,000 in negative equity. Who do you think they're going to be blaming for that position that they're in 3 or 4 years? Their buyer's agent, right? Because you didn't meet your standard of care that they engaged you to provide as a real estate expert in this industry in advising them, and you allowed them to purchase this home. Or when they lose their earnest money because you didn't fully explain the clauses that I was just talking about a little bit earlier. So how do you address those things and cover your tookishes, as they say, as you're dealing with buyers? And that is to take an extra just minute or two to, first of all, have these conversations with your clients, right? That's the first thing. You've got to be having these conversations with your buyers. This is not a market for every buyer. I could argue it's not a market for any buyer, right? And you don't want to tell your buyer clients that, but the reality is they're going to get banged up, and they're going to do things that they would never in a normal world consider doing because they have to, because other buyers are doing it, and that forces them to do those insane things. So be having those conversations, but more importantly, for the purposes of protecting yourselves down the road, both for the short-term earnest money dispute because of a bad faith allegation, or the long-term negative equity situation that I believe is a very real possibility over the course of the next 3, 4, 5 years. Send them an email. As you go back to write that offer, it doesn't have to be formal, it doesn't have to be overly lawyery, it doesn't have to be browbeating, but to simply go back after you've had that conversation and they've instructed you to write this offer, waiving contingencies or adding appraisal gap clauses, or making offers that are well above market, to send a simple little email saying, hey, I'm writing your offer right now. I just want to confirm the conversation we had about the concerns of creating negative equity, or of waiving this clause, or agreeing to bring additional money. And please confirm that we talked about this, and if you're going to sign this offer and the seller's going to accept it, then you've got the ability to perform irrespective of what that extra $10,000 or $20,000 check that you're going to have to bring to closing is going to do to your qualifications under the loan provisions, right? Sending a simple email like that, and you can do it in your own way, in your own voice, but having that in your transaction file is going to be a brick of gold down the road when your buyer points their finger at you and says, you didn't meet your standard of care with me. You didn't do what I hired you to do in that regard. So be conscious, be more conscious than ever as you're performing these crazy things on behalf of your buyers. Now I'm going to maybe surprise you a little bit with the seller side of concerns related to this. One of the things that I'm seeing a heck of a lot more of is buyers waiving inspection conditions, waiving inspection contingencies, waiving inspection, essentially, right? And not performing inspections. That's insane. That's insane for a buyer. But I might even argue it's more insane for a seller to allow that. Because think about you as a seller when you allow a buyer not to inspect a property or to waive their inspection. What does that mean? It means that 100% of the buyer's lens, their eyeballs on the property, their view of the property, 100% of that flows from one place, the seller's property disclosure. That's it. That's the only thing they know about the property. If they don't have an inspection, the only thing they know about the property is what the seller discloses in the seller's property disclosure. So unless your seller is willing to essentially perform an inspection themselves and write a book as they deliver a seller's property disclosure to a buyer who's not going to be performing an inspection, I think they're absolutely nuts. And I think your listing brokers are absolutely nuts if you're allowing your sellers to do that. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever for a seller. Because think about that post-closing. All of those patent defects, those things, those little nooks and crannies and cracks and crevices and all the little stains in the carpet and the little things, those things that would have been easily uncovered by just simply allowing a buyer to perform, even if they didn't hire an inspector, allowing a buyer to perform their own inspection, that they would have uncovered, or they would have essentially waived because they were patent, obvious, open conditions. Those are all now essentially latent conditions because there's no formal inspection right. So think about the post-closing lawsuit when the seller moves in to a property and there's, stains in the carpet. Well, that should have been disclosed. That's an adverse material fact that should have been disclosed. Now, if they're going to perform an inspection, it's going to disclose itself. And the seller is, I would argue, sort of off the hook. Some of that stuff is so obvious that any reasonable judge is never going to hold a seller liable for not disclosing something that any idiot with two eyes could have seen. But you take the inspection out of the picture for the buyer, I don't know where that goes, honestly, for the seller. So avoid that, both on the buy side for the obvious reasons, but think about the sell side. Keep that in mind as you're a listing broker. What's the solution there? I think any of you guys, and one of the reasons you're hired is because you have relationships. So I know inspectors are busy, I know everybody's busy, and I know everything takes a little bit of time. But as opposed to allowing a buyer to waive an inspection as if that's some sort of a sexy, offer that a seller might want to accept, it might cost you a case of beer to the home inspector, or an extra couple $100 to the home inspector to get him to do a rush inspection. Much, much better for the buyer, and much, much, much better for the seller, in my view. So be cautious on both sides. As attractive as these offers may appear on their face, I think it creates a lot of potential post-closing liability for a seller when they're allowing buyers to do things like that. So, all right, so that's my kind of crazy market condition stuff that I wanted to talk about. And I'll come back with questions about that. One other thing I kind of want to touch on a little bit. So some of you guys have probably maybe heard me talking a little bit about this. This is another thing I've been talking a bunch about, and this is a change that our industry is going to see significantly over the course of the next, very soon. Very soon. I'm not exactly sure when. We're still waiting to see the final upshot and agreement. But as some of you know, NAR and the Department of Justice reached a settlement related to an antitrust investigation that the DOJ undertook. They started it in June of 2019. And they started it, unlike the lawsuits, we have these civil class action lawsuits that we've talked about before, and I'm not going to rehash. Those are also based in antitrust. But those are private actions, and so you have to articulate a claim. You have to explain what you're suing about if you're a citizen and you're going to file a lawsuit. When the DOJ, a law enforcement agency, federal law enforcement agency, wants to do something, they don't have to explain anything. They just start shooting subpoenas around. And so in June of 2019, they shot subpoenas to CoreLogic, which is the backbone of Matrix and the backbone of most MLSs in the entire country, based out of California. And they basically said, we want all of your MLS records for the last 5 years kind of thing. And it came on the heels of those civil lawsuits, the class action lawsuits based in antitrust. And I think there was a pretty good assumption in the industry among people who pay attention to that stuff at the time that this has some interesting implications and there's some interesting overlap to the timing of everything. Well, so that was June of 2019 when they subpoenaed that information. As of, I don't know if it was it was either late November, early December of last year, we saw a formal announcement, a joint announcement by the Department of Justice and by NAR that a settlement, the basic terms of a settlement had been agreed to on this matter. And the actual settlement agreement was going to be completed during the first quarter of this year. So it's currently I'm sure it's probably in a very advanced to final stage, because I know NAR was hoping at their board of directors meeting, which I think, Ann, is that next week?
That's right.
Is it this Friday?
Next Friday.
So it may not happen because I don't know if it's been distributed, but they were hoping to have the board of directors approve the settlement, the final terms of the settlement agreement. I still haven't seen the document. So the reality of it is it's going to be a rubber stamp, because it's not as if the NAR board of directors is going to say, yeah, we're not going to sign that, right? This is going to get signed no matter basically what it says, as long as it's consistent with the basic terms that were announced. So those basic terms that were announced in November or December of last year essentially do a couple of things. Thing number one that they do is there's no more free. So buyers agents that are advertising anything as being free, their services are free, there's no cost to their services, that can no longer occur. Buyers agents are no longer allowed to advertise things as being free. makes sense, and there's some, I don't really have a problem necessarily with that, maybe most of you don't either. The things that are going to have an impact, though, are two additional aspects of the settlement. One aspect of the settlement is going to be that the cooperating commission that is listed in the MLS is no longer going to be it can no longer be in any realtor-owned MLS a private data field. So what that means is it would be like, how when you have your MLS fields and then you have your syndicated fields, and the syndicated fields are bedrooms, bathrooms, price, maybe some additional notes for the public. But it's never been, in most any MLS, with very minor exceptions in the country, it's never been the cooperating commission that's being offered to the buyer's agent. That will now be the case, effective very shortly, within the next couple of months, I would imagine. So now when your buyers are going to go and Google a property and they see the property, they're going to see what the offered compensation is to the cooperating agent, the dollar amount or the percentages. And just before I forget, if we get into any questions or anything, I do not want any numbers, dollar amounts, percentages, anything else thrown out in the room and questions. I'll come off the stage and strangle you personally. But that will now be a public data field that will be available to consumers, as well as other realtors that are non-participants of your MLS. Now remember, that is not an offer of compensation to anybody. That dollar amount or the percentage is not an offer of compensation to anybody who is not a participant in your MLS. So you don't have to, you haven't made that offer to them like you have to your other fellow participants within your own MLS. But it will be disclosed. And that's going to have some interesting implications, particularly when tied with the second change that has been that will be mandated by the settlement agreement. And that is that realtor associations and or MLSs will no longer be allowed to preclude non-participant or board member licensees, real estate, other licensees, or other realtors from other markets, from accessing lockboxes on your listings. You can no longer preclude that unless your seller instructs otherwise, okay? So if your seller instructs you that I only want to work with GJARA MLS participants or members, they can do that. It's going to be pretty unusual because I've always had the opinion, in most cases, there may be exceptions, but in most cases, I think that a seller doesn't care if the buyer or the buyer's agent is from Grand Junction or Denver or Mars, for that matter. They want to sell their house. And so you're going to have to be a little bit cautious about how that conversation dovetails with your seller. But they could limit access themselves. But if the seller's not limiting access, then the association in MLS or listing brokerage firm is not able to limit access to lockboxes. So that's going to be an interesting change. And when you marry those two changes together, this disclosure of cooperating commissions with lockbox access being much less protected to other licensees, I think we're going to see a lot more traveling realtors, right? Realtors that say, oh, my Denver neighbor's going to move to Grand Junction, they want to come do a deal here. You guys, I don't know why any of your neighbors would want to move to Denver, but you get, if that were to occur, then you could do that. But you get my point. That I think it's going to help perpetuate a lot more of the traveling realtor phenomenon, which is certainly concerning to me because of competency issues, right? Those are Division of Real Estate rules, and those aren't yours to enforce. But I think we're going to see a lot. Well, we'll see. I think we may see some more of that because of those two new rules that are coming along, like I say, very, very shortly. So keep your eye on that. And then the other thing that I think is going to, because of the syndication of cooperating commissions, I think buyer agent commissions specifically are going to become a much more active topic between you and your buyer clients, between buyers who may be coming now to listing brokers who say, Mr. Listing Broker, I don't have an agent, and I see on the syndication portal that you're offering, $92 as a cooperating commission that you're not going to have to pay my agent because I don't have one. So I would like a concession or some credit or some rebate or something. And so I think we're going to be seeing more of that as this conversation related to buyer commissions naturally increases and buyers' general awareness of offered commissions increases. And so I'll end my comments with this. I think it is going to be more incumbent than ever upon you guys, particularly buyer's agents, to make sure that you have well defined your value proposition. right? That you know what you do. Every person in this room has one. Every person in this room, you wouldn't be sitting in this room. You have colleagues that are not in this room. And you can all think of somebody in your marketplace who dabbles as a broker but offers zero value proposition to their clients, right? All of you who take the time to do these things and engage in formats like this have a value proposition. But I've found that there's essentially three types of realtors as it relates to value proposition. There's realtors who don't put the easy ones first. They don't have a value proposition. They don't have one. They're part-time, half in, half out. They don't study, they don't learn, they don't care. They're just in it to do a few deals and make a little money, and they don't offer a value proposition. I think that quadrant or segment of the brokerage community is going to struggle, as they should. They're going to have a heck of a hard time as the market gets a little tougher to participate in. And maybe it'll shake them out, and maybe that's a good thing for all of us. The second quadrant that's easy to talk about is the brokers who have a value proposition, and they're really good at articulating it. They know how to sell their value proposition. Those are the top producers in every market, no matter where you are. They've been killing it for years, and they're going to continue to kill it because they have a value proposition, and they know how to articulate and sell that value proposition. All right? The other segment of the brokerage community, this is the one that I'm most empathetic with because it's frustrating because they have a value proposition, but they're not great at articulating or selling that value proposition, right? So they're going to do well because they actually offer a value proposition, but they're not going to do as well as they could if they would button up that other piece, really learn how to figure out what do I offer. And it's always going to be unique among everybody, right? Different buyers and different sellers are going to look for and require different things. There's going to be different bells, personality types, whatever it might be. But learning how to articulate your value proposition, because you all have one, is going to become, I think, that much more important over the course of the next several years as we see this market change quite a bit. We've already seen the changes over the last 10 or 15 years. As if you were a buyer and you wanted to find out what was available, you were left to look through the Sunday newspaper at what was going to be an open house, right? Well, that changed pretty quickly. And now that piece of the value proposition, which was providing access to property information through syndication and technology, that has really been pulled away. It's the other stuff now that you guys need to be leaning on. And so take time and invest in yourself and your business to figure out what your value proposition is, and then work on selling it, work on learning how to articulate that to your potential clients. And you'll move yourself into that segment that I believe is bulletproof in any economy, no matter what happens with the market, what happens with the DOJ settlement, what happens with any of this stuff. So be thinking about those things, and I will pipe it and let you guys ask any questions.
So we have limited time for questions, but